Editorial notes from Os Cangaceiros, number 2. The function of unions in the impending class conflict. The poor in their struggle for the most elementary survival. The destruction of domination as the main aim of the oppressed. Violence and amazement. For an early detection of the emerging conditions of subversion. Slip the moorings. Our epoch is marked by the return of the poor to the initial ferocity. A workers' movement, dominated by reformist and Stalinist ideas and organized by bureaucratic mechanisms, had managed to civilize the proposals of the poor almost everywhere. The Popular Front was the most important moment of this process. The integration of the old workers' movement into civil society is thoroughly completed by now. In the 1970s, workers in revolt never pushed themselves beyond the limits of the system. Their struggles continually surpassed union orders, but nonetheless almost always remained in line with union mechanisms themselves. The unions were thus able to maneuver and pacify with sufficient force to finally win this war of attrition. The boundless demands that rebelling workers then put forward seem to have ebbed for the time being. The greater portion of the most important conflicts of the last few years within the enterprises were mainly defensive, carried out against the effects of recent industrial modernization. In the 1970s, unions could not allow themselves to openly disavow the excesses of rebelling workers without risk. In the 1980s, they cannot allow themselves to uphold them. In Poland, in 1981, the leadership of Solidarnosc ended up denouncing the wildcat strike movement and disavowing the endless demands of the workers in the name of the national interest. In Great Britain, the TUC, the miners' union, used every means to prevent attempts at practical solidarity with the striking miners, organizing their isolation in this way and managing in the end to guarantee their defeat. In France, in December 1983 to January 1984, in Talbot, the CGT and the CSL, General Trade Union and Trade Union, respectively, fought against striking immigrant workers, one of the unions internally, the other externally. The workers were defeated in isolation. In Spain, the attitude of the UGT, the General Union, and CCOO, the Trade Union, particularly in recent times when they fought against the practice of self-organized assemblies, springs from the same redistribution of police functions. Everywhere, these workers' revolts were sold off in the name, the same principle. Earlier, the unions appealed to an end. Now they appeal to the interests of the company. In this period, the bureaucrats have reached the point where they can discuss the 1970s. Today, these union apparatuses are involved in a systematic way as managers in meddling in the affairs of the companies. The reformist conception of self-management has entered into union practice that is now mainly dedicated to co-management. What wasn't yet obvious in 1968 has now become so. The workers' movement defined itself in this way. It was about making a collective legal subject out of the mass of workers, a subject that defended its interests in a civil society. The struggles of the 1970s made this all collapse. At the time, the poor, who was still united in the factory by identical working conditions, could form a single force that expressed itself in the demand for an anti-hierarchical wage and in the refusal of work itself, via absenteeism, slowdown of the rhythms of production, sabotage, etc. Against this force, capitalism reacted like this. It reintroduced market forces as the only reference point and also undertook the complete reorganization of the exploitation of labor, increasing competition among the poor. Unions, based on wage hierarchy and the identification of the worker with his company, participate completely in the organization of this competition. In the same way, they have broken with the language of the old workers' movement, replacing it with the more empirical jargon of managers. As one expert recently stated, quote, "Companies sometimes discover that they are facing negotiators who, surprisingly, speak the same economic language they do," end quote. The main concern of the unions is simply to legally ratify, together with the bosses in the state, what has already been going on in practice for some time. For example, all the chatter about work flexibility or the guaranteed interoccupational minimum wage. It is now openly admitted that unions, businessmen, and the state all speak the same language. Only a tiny minority of union activists still cling desperately to the language of the former workers' movement, the praises of which they continue to sing. The period is over in which workers could get anywhere in their struggles by placing themselves behind union cover, forcing their delegates to follow them in order to avoid open dissent. For the first time, in France, Strikers have been individually sentenced to pay compensation to scabs and not to their unions. It happened at the beginning of 1985 in the Delcy establishment near Calais. Then, it happened again in the transport industry, where 15 drivers, who were fired following the strike, were sentenced by the Arras court to pay 52,600 francs out of their own pockets to 7 non-strikers brought together in the Association for the Freedom to Work. Mediations, which have the task of integrating workers, have now gone through an entire cycle. It is now assumed that workers should follow the same logic as their union representatives and identify themselves completely with the operation of the company. In Great Britain, for example, the American and Japanese businesses that are being reintegrated into the automobile and electronics sectors impose their conditions. Managers define the new rules for the management of work in close collaboration with the unions, entrusting them with imposing rules on workers. In some cases, it is a stipulation in which the subordinate voluntarily gives up the right to strike. But this progress in the exploitation of labor has had to be accompanied by a conditioning of the labor force, as is done in Japan and South Korea. If factories over there are true barracks where work is militarized, it is still necessary to impose a religious cult on the workers. Need and terror are not sufficient to rally enthusiasm for work in wage laborers, even in Asia. Managers of Japanese enterprises, who act like genuine cult leaders, have understood this. The enemy cannot organize new forms of labor with nothing but a barracks regime. It responds to this problem by adding a religious or secular lie. This is what a dynamic entrepreneur in France was expressing when he declared, "Businesses lacking a creed." Capitalists can freely impose the most draconian conditions on the poor insofar as the unique strength of workers in revolt was broken at the start of the 1980s in the name of the crisis. It is a return to the principles of 19th century capitalism, seizing people through hunger by organizing the spectacle of misery, as happened with the phenomenon of the so-called new poor. In this way, people have had unthinkable wages and working conditions imposed on them for nearly 10 years. The labor force is kept completely at the disposal of employers. The unions euphemistically call this work flexibility. Through related additional unpaid hours, Sunday work, wage decreases imposed through the blackmail firing, and so on. And some enterprises that are going through difficulties even go so far as to appeal to the workers for voluntary participation so that capital is formed from their donation of all or part of their wage. The extreme case happened in Lyons in the start of 1985, when a panel appointed an extremist as the head of a factory in difficulty put forth the donation of 2 months' wages by the employees as the condition for saving the enterprise. The few that refused did well. After the payments were made, the new manager ran away overseas with the cash box. All that crawls upon the earth is subject to being crushed. The universal history of desperation. Even under the reign of the spectacle, the principle of money had manifested itself up to this point as pure necessity. Individuals have never been so firmly brought back to their destitute condition. It's a matter of putting the poor back in their place. It is necessary to make them drool before the omnipotence of money. In Poland, for example, it isn't so difficult to make money by trafficking in the black market, as many people do. But it is much more difficult to get a hold of goods. Warehouses are empty. For us, scarcity is organized in the reverse manner. Warehouses are full, but it is quite difficult to get a hold of money. We have met Polish people in France who are amazed by the zeal of the French for work. In Poland, there is none of this, quite the opposite. It's just that, in our damned country, for many people, the mere reality of having a job, no matter how disgusting or badly paid, seems like a divine favor. All the same, there are those who spit on the offer. The now irreversible increase in those unemployed for life is certainly the direct consequence of the more rational organization of exploitation. But it is much more than a quantitative result. It is something qualitative. To a great extent, it is the young who cannot accept submission to the new conditions imposed on workers. If many young people don't have work, it is because they don't want it. And as the conditions of wage labor become more and more vile, the conditions of existence for the unemployed are becoming more and more stifling. At the beginning of 1984, the French state attacked voluntary unemployment by reducing the welfare system to a minimum. Starting from this reduction, it consequently introduced voluntary underpaid work, jobs of common utility. For more than 6 months, we have been watching young imbeciles declare on TV that even though this work was badly paid, it was better than being left with nothing to do. A dual advantage for the state, and manages to make them say that outside of work, even when it's badly paid, they wouldn't know what to do with their youth. Working is having nothing to do. Those who buckle down, lowering themselves to this level, can joyfully accept any badly paid job. If it becomes increasingly unbearable to work due to the conditions of greater submission that keep coming on, it is also increasingly difficult not to work. Today, it is becoming impossible to devise something for one's immediate subsistence by only working occasionally or collecting unemployment benefits. In our opinion, the delinquency at the beginning of the 1970s expressed a desire for freedom, a wild shift, a game of mops. Though the search for money was part of it, it wasn't the main goal. In the 1980s, this carefree atmosphere was exhausted. This criminal freedom reached its peak in the autumn of 1981, with the corralling and burning of cars in East Lyons. From then on, the state and the society's defenders have taken action to make such excesses impossible. The reign of necessity did the rest. A young man told us that in 1981 they stole cars to amuse themselves. Now, they must first of all have a useful function, and at least serve for a few thefts and robberies, after which one can amuse herself with them. Thus, it has become difficult to steal a high-powered car. The ferocity of police and judiciary repression, as signaled by an unprecedented wave of summary executions. Footnote: this is a reference to murders carried out by police and vigilante shop owners against thieves and other usually petty criminals that occurred in France at the time. It is talked about a bit more in Nothing Human is Achieved in the Grip of Fear. Returning to the text. Has brought about the end of an epoch. All these individuals who were unemployed for life thus fill the prisons, giving rise to an automatic overpopulation. Workers are not spared and have to deal with the police more frequently. Debts, the impossibility of paying rent and other bills, bounced checks, thefts in the supermarket, and so on, lead an ever greater number of people to risk prison. This return to the most brutal reign of necessity has effectively exacerbated the hostility and competition that regulates relationships among the poor in society. Isolation and atomization dominate everything without contest. An atmosphere of anxiety and oppression never before known comes out of this. It has reached a point that in some big cities of the USA, there are people who die suddenly in solitude. The spread of drugs, which has very nearly annihilated the rage of so many young people, is obviously one of the more direct consequences of this state of things and helps to augment it. Now, no mediation is possible between the people's misery and civil society. The revolts that have occurred since 1968 forced the enemy to modernize oppression and thus make the world even more unlivable and poverty even more visible. The old principle of 1789 returns to the first position in hostile preoccupations, filling the chasm that has been so dangerously produced between creating the ruling class and the poor over the last few years. This is what an entire generation of reformists under state orders are concerned with. Obviously, they only speak the language of the state and preach the democratic lie to the mass of the poor. The bourgeoisie is brutally confronted with the thing that defines it, the absence of community pushed to its fever pitch by renewed social conditions. The violence that reigns among the poor, which is sometimes practiced openly among them, is equal to the violence of the conditions that constrain them. At the same time that all the poor fully submit to the rules of the war of all against all, they can no longer aspire to a civilized existence and so become decidedly dangerous. This moment when separation has invaded everything also shows us that the poor cannot constitute a collective legal subject like in the period of the former workers' movement. Their dissatisfaction returns to its original basis, i.e., the ferocity that characterized the rebellion before society tried to civilize them. Thus, during the last miners' strike in Great Britain, strikers made use of criminal forms of action that are reminiscent of the punitive expedition to which English workers abandoned themselves at the beginning of the 19th century, the very ones to which Engels referred in The Situation of the Working Class in England, that is to say, before trade unionism had civilized the poor and crushed their rage. Fanatics of the Apocalypse. In Hasel, people going to see a soccer match of some importance did not have specific reason for dissatisfaction. On the contrary, they basically went to have a fine evening. The organizers of the spectacle never imagined that the misery of the crowd could explode like this inside the stadium. They had said there was no reason for violence. In Hasel, the spectacle had to demonstrate its function of manipulation of the lonely crowds, in live broadcasts, play by play, to millions of people, at the very moment that this manipulation escaped from their hands. In live broadcasts, the rulers lost their heads. And the thing that shocked spectators so much was not the 38 deaths, but the fact that they witnessed such violence on a live broadcast, that the spectacle wasn't able to spare them this time. They were embarrassed that they had seen it. The scandal was so great that in West Germany, they simply blocked the press report. A journalist from Le Monde asked in dismay, in an article about the affair, what effect might all this have among Black African people upon whom we once tried to impose our civilization? The match was broadcast live to several African countries. Since that time, we have seen a reggae concert in Guinea take a turn for the worse due to the excitement of the spectators who finally destroyed the show facilities. During the same period, in Greece, concert organizers gave orders to security guards to play with the sole aim of calming the riotous crowd. Even so, the crowd treated the singers as wicked servants incapable of relieving the dissatisfaction and broke everything. Wild ones are everywhere in the world. The mere fact that we came to the defense of hooligans against slander and repression caused scandal everywhere, even among people close to us. The arguments that have been used against us all originate from the same moral judgment that sees only an irrational and gratuitous violence in these actions. There are no gratuitous acts in the world. There are those who learn this at a great price. Hooliganism is an immediate expression of dissatisfaction that is not at all surprising after a week of boredom and work. Misery is always somewhat shameful, somewhat sacrilegious to reformists. First of all, they don't understand what everyday misery really is, and therefore they don't understand the violence it generates. We affirm that the poor are united only in a breaking of all social controls and the annihilation of all laws. Otherwise, they do not in any way form a community. The poor can only recognize each other in the expression of their dissatisfaction. Through this, the overturning of the situation takes place and they find themselves united in confronting a common enemy. The day after the beautiful uprising in Handsworth, an English police chief deplored the fact that the people looked upon the thing as entertainment, just like soccer hooliganism. In any case, the Hazel affair has created new conditions for hooligans, with the military patrols of the stadia that followed from it. Now, anyone who goes to a match to let off steam will be obliged to attack the huge number of police present in the place rather than fighting with the fans of the opposing teams. This already happened in Leicester on October 9, 1985. The moment that the bourgeoisie and the state finish organizing the separation that defines the poor and makes their existence utterly unlivable is also the moment that creates the conditions for an overturning of the situation. What separates people and precisely makes poor people of them is also what identifies them. The poor don't know each other. They recognize each other. In Marseille, at the beginning of September 1985, after a pursuit following a failed robbery, police shot down one of the young robbers near the La Paternelle neighborhood. The inhabitants of the area rose up in revolt and attacked the cops, who had to retreat after a vigorous exchange of rocks and grenades. Police and journalists were surprised because the unfortunate victim was not from the area or even an Arab. If he had but been from the area, police would have had to confront an upheaval as violent as those of Brixton and Tottenham. The young people who live in La Paternelle are almost all Arabs, and immediately recognized themselves in the fate that the police had reserved for the unknown youth, since they suffer exactly the same harsh and painful conditions. Even in the Le Halles neighborhood of Paris, which is psychogeographically the opposite of the suburban neighborhoods of Marseille, the arrest of a small-time drug dealer led 400 people to gather and attack the police and the rich area at the center of Paris. This happened last year in September. Here, an attempt was made to overcome the contradictory reign of indifference and futility in Le Halles. We are satisfied by this. We, the Cangaceiros. We speak a lot about the violence on the outskirts of the cities. However, there is no need to think that this is the only place that anything is going on. It's just that many people who share our conditions live there, as do ourselves at times. We speak of nothing but violence. It is our element, and we could even say, our daily destiny. Violence is first of all the conditions that are imposed upon us. Then there is the violence of the police who defend these conditions. And unfortunately, more rarely, there is the violence that we throw back in their faces. We don't know all of our enemies, but we know what they defend. Our allies are not all obliged to be our accomplices, but at times it happens that some of them are. We do not have relations with all of our allies. The unemployed who fight against poverty are our allies, as are the workers who rebel against work and escape the control of the unions. We don't think that we possess a universal truth, but we intend to communicate what we think. Universal truths are the ones that are communicated, not the ones that are possessed. We tell those who ask if we are assembliists or councilists that we are interested in knowing how people establish and organize dialogue. We are not terrorists because we support underground activity. It was once said that the old mole digs. In our times, people who affirm revolutionary demands pass for dreamers. But the human being is made of the same material that his dreams are made from. We are revolutionaries. Os Cangaceiros means everything is possible. We are at war. Nothing is true, everything is permitted. There are many of us relative to the reigning atomization, and we have allies everywhere. Our program is very old, to live without dead time. We propose to make it known through scandal. There are no other means worthy of such a program. Our existence itself is already a scandal. We are clearly not indispensable, but on many occasions we have had to be so. In social war, no one can be exonerated. We are also very suspicious. Experience shows that one is never sufficiently so. Distrust is never enough. Distrust is judged by the trust that is placed apart from what we call the world of work, since we have escaped from this very world. But when struggles deserving of the name take place, they are against the world of work and unleash a rage against that which forces the poor to work, the need for money. We explain the fact that there are no groups like us in Europe at this time with this thought. We are simply the first. Of course, our writings have a negligible distribution when compared with our enormous ambitions. But we count on the strength of the spirit of our readers to pose a remedy for this. And this does not call our ambition into question. The distribution of our writings obviously has nothing to do with the massive daily distribution of lies in the press. If few people read our writings, they are addressed to potential correspondents, not to a mass of spectators. Better to have selected and combative people with us than amorphous masses. This favors our enormous ambitions. We are against all hierarchy and consider our association egalitarian insofar as everyone is capable of making decisions within it. The fact that we make references to intellectuals like Marx and Hegel doesn't bother us. In their time, one could be an intellectual without being an intellectual whore. Now this isn't possible anymore. Furthermore, they were not just intellectuals in that they had an effect on reality. We consider it possible to have continuous contact with other groups on this basic condition, that it goes beyond every form of agitation, propaganda, in the way it goes into action. What we criticize in politics is the state. We must bring something new to this epoch, and we even have the means for doing so. When we met at various times with some striking miners in Great Britain, they asked us these elementary questions. What force do you really constitute? What can you do with the information we give you? We need to be able to answer such questions clearly, especially since not everyone can understand a group like ours. In Poland, they asked this as well. But who are you then? What is your movement? We need to be able to demonstrate the universal nature of our existence. The interest we have in the revolts of those like us goes beyond the interest that an isolated poor person, without means, has for the world. Although we occupy ourselves with what interests us, it is quite clear that we do not intend, in any case, to furnish aid to other people's struggles. We merely intend to meet people and take part in their joy. Most of the rebel workers that we meet are influenced by their militant attitude that comes out of the former workers' movement. In the current state of things, we can count on having encounters with individuals on their own, but sometimes we also get in contact with various organized groups that still hold to some illusions about unionism with rebel workers. Though the activism of these groups leaves us indifferent, we know people in these groups who are quite close to us due to their refusal of work. Young people of the urban outskirts are in the habit of meeting isolated people or those who have come together in local gangs. When they meet us, they are always a bit surprised to see a well-formed and organized group. On the other hand, when workers in struggle, who are in the habit of seeing people who act as members of an official organization, meet us, they marvel at seeing individuals who seem to act on their own. In Great Britain and Spain, many workers in revolt have continued to be amazed to see a group of those unemployed for life that is organized, with contacts and information on an international scale, and capable of making use of certain means for being independent of any political or union apparatus. In the end, we arouse the interest of others through our very existence. In every way, the only serious risk that we incur is that of dying of poverty. Os Cangaceiros.
Force est de constater que trop se perd dans l'autocensure, un angle qui obture les nerfs et les nerfs.